We continue now at the top of Daf Chesam and Beis in Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 8b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought sources for Chatas Chaylev, that's a regular case of Chatas, and also for Chatas Nazir and Chatas Mitzora, that Shinoi Bailim and Shinoi Kodesh are Ma'akev, that if a person has a change in thought in terms of what carbon he's bringing, or a change in thought in terms of what owner he's bringing it for, so then it's completely possible. But the Gemara continues and asks, Chatas da Avodas Kochavim, what about the Chatas by Avodah Zara, Ude Shmias HaKol, and the Chatas by Shmias HaKol, Uvitois Vasayim, and the Chatos by Bitois Vasayim, V'Tomas Mikdash V'Kadoshav, and the Chatos by Tomas Mikdash V'Kadoshav, all of these various kinds of Chatos in the Torah, the Lo Ksibahu, where it's not written over there a source, again for Shinoi Kodesh and Shinoi Bailim. So Manolan, from where do we know that in all of these cases Shinoi Kodesh and Shinoi Bailim are Ma'akev? And the Gemara answers, Chatas da Avodas Kochavim, the Chatas by Avodas Zara, Asyam e Chatas Chaylev, that comes from Chatas Chaylev, Shekain Kares Kamosa, that's Kares just like it, V'hanach Kulhi, and all of the rest, Asyam b'Mahatzad, they come through a Mahatzad, essentially a Tzad HaShava, where you're learning from more than one case of Chatas, finding a common denominator and learning to these cases. And Rashi explains, Chatas da Avodas Kochavim, the Chatas of Avodah Zara, the Chsib Parsha Shlach Lecha, that's written in Parsha Shlach. V'lo Ksib b'Ha'inyon, it's not written in the same place, talking about the Chatas sources that we had on the previous Amud. V'chein Chatas to Shmias HaKol, lo Ksib b'Ha'inyon, and also the Chatas of Shmias HaKol is not included in the Chatas source that we brought in the previous Amud. Dahu Inyona b'Chatas to Shigas Kares Kaima, because what we brought in the previous Amud was talking about the carbon Chatas that's brought when you do something by mistake, where if you would have done it on purpose, you would get Kares. Kedi Alfin and Baharios, like we learn out in Harios. So again, that's why we need a source for Chatas of Avodah Zara, Shmias HaKol, Bitois Vasayim, Tomas Mikdash V'Kadoshav. And Rashi continues, Shmias HaKol, that refers to Shvuas HaEdus, that refers to the oath that someone takes that they don't know testimony in a particular case, it's a false oath. V'Shama Kol Allah, the pasuk says V'Shama Kol Allah. U'Shvuas Bitoy refers to a false oath. V'Tomas Mikdash V'Kadoshav, and Tomas Mikdash V'Kadoshav, Bechad and Yona Ksivi, those are all written in the same place. B'Karban Ola V'Yored, the halacha is there that the person brings what's called a carbon ola v'yored, a variable chatas. The chatas changes based on how wealthy the person is, whether he brings an animal or a bird carbon, or whether he brings a mincha. V'shama kol olo nefesh kisi shava levate o nefesh asher tiga. That's the pasuk. Umukma lo b'Meseches Shvuos b'Tomas Mikdash v'Kadoshav. And at the end of that pasuk that we just quoted, that's talking about Tomas Mikdash v'Kadoshav. And the Gemara ultimately answered that the chatos of Avodah Zara can be learned directly from Chatas Chaylev, the classic case of chatos, and the other ones are all learned out through a Tzad HaShaveh. Asyon b'Mahatzad, they're learned through a Mahatzad, Mechatas Chaylev v'Chatas Nazir Mitzora, from the sources we brought in the previous Amud, which was Chatas Chaylev, the classic case of Chatas, Chatas of a Nazir, and the Chatas of a Mitzora. T'chiparacht mal Chatas Chaylev shekein kares, because whatever question you'll ask, you'll be able to come up with a good common denominator. When you try to refute it, that Chatas Chaylev is unique because it involves kares. Chatas Nazir Mitzora yochichu, Nazir Mitzora can prove the other way, they're not kares. Mal Chatas Nazir Mitzora shekein yeshimo and dam macherim, Nazir Mitzora, there's other carbonos that are brought with them. Chatas Chaylev tochiach, the classic Chatas Chaylev proves the other way because there's not dam macherim. Hatzad HaShavah shaben v'chulu, the common denominator is that all of these are Chatases, and we say that it's ma'akev in terms of Shinoi Kodesh and Shinoi Bailim. Afani yavi Chatas to Shmias HaKol, so too you bring the Chatas of Shmias HaKol, the same halacha. Umei Chatas Chaylev v'chodem ehani lo asya. Now you can't learn from Chatas Chaylev and one of the others. D'imei Chatas Chaylev v'Chatas Nazir, if you're just going to pick one of the others, let's say Chatas Chaylev and Chatas Nazir, equal mifrach mal hatzad HaShavah shebehen shekein einon boin bedalus. You can say that what's unique is that they don't have the concept of a variable Chatas. Tomar b'Shvuas Bitoy shiba ola v'yored. So Shvuas Bitoy is a variable Chatas. And imei Chatas Chaylev v'Chatas Mitzora, if you're going to try to bring just from Chatas Chaylev and Chatas Mitzora, equal mifrach, you can refute it. Mal hatzad HaShavah shebehen shekein einon b'she'ela. The Tzad HaShavah, the common denominator is that there's no concept of she'ela. You can't ask a chacham and undo it. Tomar b'shua, whereas when it comes to an oath, sheyeshna b'she'ela, it's possible to undo it. Nazir also is yeshna b'she'ela. So actually, when the Gemara says it's learned from a mahatzad, it has to be learned from the combination of all three sources: Chatas Chaylev, Chatas Nazir, and Chatas Mitzora. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Pesach bismana, when the carbon Pesach is brought at its proper time, so then lishmo kosher, if it's brought for its sake, as a carbon Pesach, it's kosher. Shalo lishmo pasul, but if it's brought not lishmo, it's pasul. Uveshari yemos hashan, if you bring it during the rest of the time of the year, lishmo pasul, so then if it's brought lishmo, it's actually pasul. Shalo lishmo kosher, but if it's shalo lishmo, then it is kosher. And Rashi explains that it's proper time, shalo lishmo pasal, if it's not lishmo, it's pasal, kedamrina, like we said earlier. And b'shari yemos hashana, during the rest of the year, it's the opposite. Lishmo pasal, if you bring it as a carbon pesach, it's actually disqualified. Kedamrina b'Meseches psachim, that we say in Meseches psachim, shachtu kodem chatzos, if you shecht it before chatzos, pasal, it's disqualified, it's not the right time. T'chsib bein harboim, because it says bein harboim, it can't be before chatzos. V'kam epamim shana hakasa b'kviyas zmano b'yodalad bein harboim, and the pasuk repeats it many times that it has to be at that particular time, and shalo lishmo kosher, but if it's not at the right time and it's shalo lishmo, it's actually kosher. Kedem efarash v'yazal, as the Gemara will go on to explain. And the Gemara continues, Menahani Mili, from where do we know this? Amar Avua de Shmuel, the father of Shmuel, says, Amar Krotz, because the pasuk says, V'imim min hatzon karbono lezevach shlomim laHashem, if he's bringing from sheep a carbon as a shlomim, and we understand that to mean, Dover haba min hatzon, something that comes from sheep, Yehei lezevach shlomim, that should be for a shlomim. And Rashi explains, Menahani Mili, from where do we know this? Devashar Yemos Hashana Shalo Lishmo Kosher, that during the rest of the year the carbon Pesach Shalo Lishmo is kosher. It says in the pasuk, Vim min hatzon karbono. And Rashi notes, Lav Kro Yisera Kadarish. The Gemara over here is not darshaning an extra pasuk. Ela mashmausa dekra mashmalei hachi. This is just the understanding of the pasuk. V'yim davar haba min hatzon, something that comes from sheep. The Hainu Pesach, that refers to the carbon Pesach, she'eno ba ela min hatzon, which only comes from sheep. Haya karbano, if that's the carbon, harehu lezevach shlamim, that's going to be considered a shlamim. V'al karchach shelo bismano kamar, and obviously we're talking not in the proper time, that it's a shlamim. The bismano hayalfinan leil, the puzzle, because if we're talking about in the proper time, it would be puzzle in such a situation, so it must be not in the proper time. Shelo lishmo is going to be lezevach shlamim, and it will be kosher. But the Gemara continues and asks, Ve'ema shlamim in midi achrina lo, but why don't we say if it's brought as a shlamim, yes, it's kosher, but if it's brought as anything else, then it would not be kosher. And Rashi explains, Ve'ema shlamim in, shachtu l'shem shlamim l'skasher, if it's slaughtered as a shlamim, it's kosher. Aval shachtu l'shem ola, but let's say it was slaughtered as an ola, lipasel, it should be disqualified. Uva brisa katani, but in the brisa it said, shalo l'shmo kosher, that if it's shalo l'shmo, it's kosher, and that implies, va'afilu shachtu l'shem ola, l'shem chatas, even if it was slaughtered as an ola or chatas, it would seem to be kosher. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rabbi Eila, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Eila says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Lezevach, the pasuk says again, Lezevach shlamim laHashem. So Lezevach is Lerabos called Zevach. When it says Lezevach, that includes all Zevach. And Rashi explains, Lezevach kro yiseirhu. Lezevach is an extra word in the pasuk. The matzi lemichtav l'shlamim. It could have just written l'shlamim. And so that's where we learn out shalo l'shmo, even for other karbonos besides shlamim. But the Gemara continues and asks, why don't we say that for whatever the person had in mind, that's what it becomes? So if he has in mind for an ola, for this Pesach Shalo Bismano, it should be an ola. And the Gemara says to that, if it wrote l'shlamim v'zevach, then what you're saying would be correct. But hashta d'chsiv l'zevach shlamim, but now that the way the pasuk is phrased is l'zevach shlamim, we interpret that to mean l'chol d'shachit lei, however the person slaughters it, shlamim lahav, it's going to have the status of a shlamim. But the Gemara continues and asks, Eimo lezevach klal, why don't we say the word lezevach is a generalization, and shlamim prat, and shlamim is a specification, and klalu prat ein bechlal elamasha beprat. When you have a klalu prat, we only say that the prat is what applies, and therefore again, shlamim in midi achrina lo, it would be only a shlamim and nothing else. And the Gemara says to that, LaHashem hadaru klal. The word LaHashem is another klal, so it's actually a klalu pratu klal, and therefore it includes more than just the shlamim. But the Gemara continues and asks, Maskif la Rav Yaakov min Nahar Pekod. Rav Yaakov from Nahar Pekod asks, Halo dami klola basra leklola kama. The latter klal of LaHashem is not similar to the earlier klal of LaZevach. And in order to be a klal upratu klal, the klolim, those generalizations have to be similar. And the Gemara continues and explains, Klola kama marbi Zevachim v'sulo. The earlier klal, that includes karbanos, and that's it. But klola basra, but the latter klal, LaHashem, which is LaHashem, called to LaHashem, that would include anything that's for Hashem, v'afilu la'ofos, v'afilu la'menachos, even if it was for bird offerings, even if it was for karban mincha, not only for zvachim, not only for animal offerings. And the Gemara continues and says, Hatana Dvei Rabbi Shmuel, it was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Shmuel, Bechlalu Prati, Darish Ki Haigavna Klalu Pratu Klal, that in such situations we do darshan Klalu Pratu Klal, even when the first klal is not similar to the last klal. And by Klalu Pratu Klal, Iyatadon Elokein HaPrat, we say that we include anything similar to what was specified. Ma'aprat Meforish Shu Shalol Lishmo V'Kosher, just like what is specified, it's Shalol Lishmo and it's kosher. Af Kol Shu Shalol Lishmo V'Kosher, so too anything which is Shalol Lishmo is going to be kosher. But the Gemara continues and asks, Ima haprat meforosh, davar haba ben neder of an adava, but what was specified, shlomim, that's something that you bring as a neder and adava. Av kol haba ben neder of an adava, so too you have to have in mind for some carbon that could be brought as a neder and adava. Olo shlomim in, and therefore an ola and shlomim, yes, those would be included, but chatos v'asham lo, but chatos and asham would not be included. And so the Gemara says, Ela lezevach, rather, the word lezevach is ribuyahu, is an inclusion, and so therefore you're going to include the chatas and the yasham as well. But the Gemara says, but then say that whatever intention you have when you slaughter it for, that carbon is the carbon it will be. Amar Rabbi Avin says, and Rashi explains, Ela lezevach ribuyahu, rather lezevach is an inclusion, eino lashon klal, it's not a language of a generalization, v'lo darshinan le bechlal uprat, so we're not going to darshan it as a klal uprat, she'en klalos upratos boin me riboy lashon, because klal uprat, that doesn't come from extra language in the pasuk, ela mimashmos hamakros, that just comes from the simple understanding of the pasuk. Uchagon b'chol asher ta'ava nafshecha klal, for example, b'chol asher ta'ava nafshecha, which is a klal, v'chein min habehema klal, also min habehema is a klal, bakar v'tzon prat, bakar v'tzon prat, avol lezevach shlamim, but the words lezevach shlamim shtei tevos devukosein, that's two words that are attached to one another. Ki luksiv lezevach hashlamim, and the same as saying lezevach hashlamim. Ukra yisei Rabbi Almo, it's just an extra pasuk. Dahavimotzi lemichtav l'shlamim, it could have just said l'shlamim. V'chol mikra shaloshan yisur eino l'chlalu prat. Anytime a pasuk has extra language, it's not klalu prat, ela l'rabos, rather it's an inclusion. Uchaman dechsiv l'shlamim v'zevach dami, it's like writing l'shlamim v'zevach, this rabu le kol hazvachim, which would include all zvachim, all karbonos. And really over here, when the Gemara is saying ela l'zevach ribu yahu, it's returning to the answer that it said above. The Gemara above had first brought the pasuk of im henatzon karbono l'zevach shlamim l'Hashem, and as Rashi said, that was just learning from the simple explanation, the simple understanding of the pasuk, that davar haba min hatzon yehei l'zevach shlamim. And then the Gemara had asked, well, maybe it's just shlamim, but maybe nothing else. If you're going to bring it for anything else, it wouldn't be. And so then the Gemara said l'zevach, the same thing we're saying right now, that l'zevach is l'rabos kol zevach, that's to include all karbonos. And then the Gemara suggested, well, let's say whatever carbon you have in mind, called the shachit lahavi kemosa, whatever you have in mind, it should be that particular carbon, which is exactly what the Gemara is asking now. If it's being learned from lezevach, emo lechol de shachit le lahavi kevase, and so that question was asked by the Gemara above, and the Gemara had answered the question by saying, ihav eksiv l'shlamim v'zevach keduka amrit. If it said l'shlamim v'zevach, then you would be right, called the shachit le lahavi kemosa. But since it says l'zevach shlamim, it means whatever you shecht it for, it's a shlamim. But now, as Rashi is noting, as the extra word, it actually is as if it wrote l'shlamim v'zevach, and so therefore we're back to our question that again it should be whatever you are shechting it for, it should be kamosa, it should be as that carbon. We can't give the answer that the way it's phrased means to say that it's always a shlamim, and so that's why the Gemara is going to give another answer, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tes Amud Aleph.